Hey everybody, welcome to HomeRecordingMadeEasy.com and here on my YouTube channel, and just as the video title says, this is all about controlled compression and mixing within the 3D sound field. And you may be saying to yourself, what are you talking about? The 3D sound field? I've never heard of that term before. What is controlled compression? Great question. This video comes directly from my award-winning training course, Mixing Made Easy Volume 2. You will see a link in the description box below, along with a 25% off discount coupon that you can use at checkout. If after you watch this video, you say, you know what, I want to go check out the whole series, this will be valuable to me. Trust me, this is only one concept that comes out of this entire series. And when you get a handle on what is controlled compression and how to use compression to make your mix have a sense of size and depth using the 3D sound field and that whole concept, it is going to change the way you think about mixing. It is going to make your mixes go from here to here right overnight. I absolutely guarantee it. So now this clip that you're going to see right after this intro video comes directly from that course. And that's only one of the advanced techniques that I teach throughout that entire advanced mixing course. And again, link in the description box along with the coupon code. So this isn't about fancy plugins. This is going to be more of a presentation style. I urge you to sit through it. It's a little bit longer of a video, but in order for me to describe the concept to you, I do a lot of show and tell, and I show you visually exactly what these two concepts are and how to apply it to your mix. So once again, controlled compression, mixing within the 3D sound field, super important. No one is teaching this kind of stuff, and I promise you it will help your mixes. After this video, click the link in the description, use the coupon code, go check out Mixing Made Easy Volume 2. You'll thank me later that you did, and I'll see you in the video. Strip. Okay, so again, we're going to use the compression section first to do controlled compression. And you say, well, what is controlled compression? Well, controlled compression is where we use kind of a lighter compression. We're not using over compressed sounds. We're not doing parallel compression. We're not trying to add a lot of color necessarily to the tone. We're using compression in a very subtle way to not only control the dynamics of the instrument or the sound, but to also place it in the 3D sound field. By using volume panning and compression, we can place the instrument in the 3D sound field. So you say, well, what is the 3D sound field? So let's before we even use the channel strip, let's talk for a few seconds about the 3D sound field and how it kind of works. And I got this as part of a presentation, which you should have downloaded in your packet here. So let's just walk through some of these slides, and you can print this out, use this for future reference. If this sounds a little confusing to you, have no fear. You read this over and over. The more you put this into practice, the more it'll start to sink in. Once you wrap your head around it, it is quite simple. Okay, and we'll demonstrate some stuff in a few minutes. So our controlled compression in the 3D sound field. The first level of controlled compression is to even out the dynamics of a performance and place the instruments within the 3D sound field, as I just mentioned. This technique will help to add depth and separation to a mix. Okay, so that's what we're kind of talking about. And if we look at my poor excuse for a drawing here, and let me just delete all this stuff here, and let's talk about the 3D sound field for a second. Okay, so I'm not an artist. Okay, so bear with me. So here's the 3D sound field, and this is how I would recommend that you actually visualize. This is how I do it. How you visualize when you get to this stage of ready to mix. Now we've done all the technical stuff. We've done the EQ filtering, we've done the tape emulation, we threw the console emulation on there. Now we're ready to start mixing, and we're starting to get more creative, and we're not doing technical. We're not cleaning tracks, we're not doing clip jam. All that stuff is pretty much done at this point. Now we're going to start getting creative on how we want to place our instruments in the mix. So I look at this, and I look at my mix. If I'm staring at my monitors and they're sitting in front of me, my left monitor here and my right monitor, and I'm sitting and we're sitting in this section here. Okay. And I'm looking at this, looking forward, going, okay, what kind of song do I have? What kind of instrumentation do I have? And how do I want to place those instruments within this left, right, front to back area, kind of like you're looking at a stage, like in a live venue. You're looking at a band on stage. How do you want to place the instrumentation? Okay, and whenever we think about, most people think about mixing in kind of a two-dimensional kind of a thing. They just think about left and right. Okay, you pan stuff hard left, you pan stuff hard. You want to separate things. You pan, say, guitars hard left, hard right. Okay, and then we use volume as a way to maybe, control how loud something is, how close to the listener the sound is. But that's a really two-dimensional type of way of thinking, and the mix will lack depth. By using the 3D sound field, I'm not only thinking about left and right and where I'm going to place my instruments. You know, I'm not thinking about if I have drums, bass, guitar, vocal, you know, I'm not, you know, left to right, you put the drums kind of here. Again, these are poor drawings, I'm sorry. And you put a, you know, guitar kind of here, and a guitar kind of here, and a vocal kind of here, and a bass maybe kind of here, and a keyboard kind of here. By using panning, that you have everything that kind of sits very close in the mix. There's not a lot of separation, and everything kind of sits almost parallel across the stage, if you will, with very little depth. Okay, and that kind of makes the mix sound small. It sounds kind of confined. It doesn't jump out of the speakers at you. It kind of sounds like it's in a box, so to speak. By using and thinking of this in more of a three-dimensional type of a thing, not only are we thinking from left to right, we're also thinking from front to back. How far back we want things to sit. How far forward do we want things to sit? And therefore, we can add a lot more depth to a mix. So for example, in this particular song, we have a rock mix, and let me see if I can do this. And I'm drawing with a tablet here for like maybe the third time in my life. So if it looks horrible, please excuse me. So if we're sitting up here in this area here, okay, we want, in our particular song, we want maybe, if this is our stage, right? This is our stage, our live stage. Think about maybe the drums, you know, this is a rock track. So maybe we want the drums to kind of, I'm going to get my pencil tool here. Kind of think of the drums maybe being, you know, kind of like this back here more, you know, and maybe our guitars, because this is kind of a rock song, we want our guitars to be up front. You know, we got to think about, before we get to that, we got to think about, we're listening to this song, what do we want our featured instruments to be? Okay, in this rock song, is the featured instrument the drums? Is the featured instrument the vocal? Is it the guitars? Is it the keyboards? Those are primarily what we have in this particular mix. And when you get to this stage and you start talking about controlled compression and where you want to place things on the stage or in the 3D sound field, you want to think about, what is the instrument that you're trying to highlight? What are the groups of instruments that you're trying to highlight and feature? Those are the things you want to sit more forward in the mix. The other things that are more in a supporting role, you want it to sit more back in the mix. So in this particular case, it's a rock track. Typically rock music in this song with the guitars, our guitars and our vocals are going to be more of our featured instrument. Our keyboards in this case are more of a kind of a supporting role. Our drums, even though it's a rock and roll track, they're not too far back in the mix, but they're not as upfront as the guitars. And the bass, the way this bass is played, it's got a lot of kind of funky things going on. It's going to sit a little more back in the mix, kind of with the keyboards, kind of supporting the drums. Excuse me. So if I'm looking at this and I have my drums here, maybe I want my guitars are going to kind of be, you know, they're going to kind of be up here somewhere. We're going to pan things maybe hard left and hard right. So if we have a guitar here, and then we have maybe a guitar out here, and look how close I'm placing this to the listener as opposed to the drums. And then for a vocal, you know, the vocal typically in a rock track such as this is maybe going to sit right out in here in the middle. And it's going to sit a little bit ahead of the guitars, but it's going to kind of sit in the pocket. It's not going to sit way up front, and the guitars are going to sit back. Where in like an R&B track or like a ballad of jazz track with maybe just some light guitars, a stand-up bass, and maybe a light piano in the background, the vocal would sit right up front, right up at the listener. Where this, the vocal's going to tuck back a little bit in the mix. It's typically what you would do in rock music. And then maybe our keyboards, even though they're kind of panned up the center for now, you know, maybe our keyboards are sitting back here, you know, something like this. And then maybe our bass is sitting, you know, back here, something like this. Okay. It's a poor excuse for a B. Okay, so maybe this is kind of how we're looking at this. We're looking at the drums, the keys, the bass, the two guitars, and the vocal right up front in the mix. And if you kind of visualize this when you're about to make some of your first controlled compression decisions and how you want to use a compressor, we're going to get into that into a second. So how do we place these instruments in this fashion in the sound field? Okay, and depending on your mix, depending on your track, this may be a little different. This may look a little different depending on how you're going to do it. So let's talk about, let's just delete this for a second. Hopefully this is clear. And again, I would, you know, pause the video, maybe make a sketch of this yourself and kind of, you know, draw this out yourself if it helps better sink in with you on how this kind of concept works. So let's just delete, let's move this down. So again, we're talking about our first level of control compression, okay? So let's move on to the next slide. So we can place an instrument in the 3D sound field using volume, panning, and compression, as I said a little bit earlier. So these three things in unison, using these things together, we can help place the instrument in the sound field, okay, using volume, panning, and compression. When we talk about volume or loudness, the louder a sound is, the more forward it's going to sit in the mix. The softer the sound is, the more back it's going to sit in the mix. So what that means, pull up my trusty drawing here again. So if we have, let's say, a vocal, right? And if your listening position is here, and our vocal is, the fader is a little bit down in the mix. So pencil tool. Okay. So if our vocalist is in the center here, again, sorry for the poor drawing, but you'll get the point. If we turn the fader up, meaning on the mixer in our DAW, we turn the volume of the vocal up, the sound is actually going to appear to move forward in the mix. That's pretty obvious, right? I mean, that's pretty simple. If we turn the fader down in the mix, then that sound, or that instrument, in this case the vocal, is going to seem to sink back into the mix, more back towards the speaker, more into the speakers or into the monitors, or back in the 3D sound field, if that makes sense. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Look at that for a second. Turn up the volume, the sound moves forward. Turn down the volume, it moves more back. So when I'm thinking about mixing and I'm turning up volumes, I'm not just thinking, oh, I got to turn up louder because I want to hear it better. Yes, that's true, but I'm thinking about it in a way where I'm thinking to myself, I want to turn it up because I want to pull the sound forward in the mix, because I'm looking at my mix and I'm thinking about my mix in a very three-dimensional way. I'm sitting in my chair in front of my monitors. How close do I want that vocal to sit in front of me? How far away do I want it to sit in front of me? How far to the left do I want it to sit near me? How far to the right? That's why I'm kind of thinking of it. I'm not thinking of it in terms of just getting it louder. I'm thinking of it as pulling the sound forward and closer. Okay, so keep that in mind. That might be a different way for you to think, especially if you're a beginner or intermediate, but stop the video, rewind what I just said a few times. It'll start to sink in, okay? So when we talk about panning, another way we can control the instrument in the 3D sound field, when we pan stuff hard left and right, it will appear to move the sound more forward in the mix. When we pan something 50-50, say 50% to the left, 50% to the right, or 40%, when it's not completely hard left-right, it's moving more back in the mix. So again, I'll get out my trusty drawing here. I'm going to get my... Okay, so pencil tool. So for example, if we have a guitar, and if we pan the guitars, all the way over here, hard left and right, didn't want to do that. That's a guitar. And then if we pan the guitar hard right, from a 3D sound field perspective, the way it's going to appear is the sound is going to sit closer to the listener. Okay. If we pan guitars more, let's say 50-50, have two guitars, like we have lots of guitars in this track playing the same parts that we panned hard left and right, because it's a featured instrument, as we talked about, and I want to move the sound closer in the mix, so I'm going to pan it hard left and right. If these were guitars that were more a supporting role, or if they were different types of guitar parts where maybe one, the main riff is up front playing hard left and right, but then maybe some other different types of just sustaining chords or something in the background, you may not want them as up front. I might pan some of those guitars kind of 50-50. So if I did this like kind of 50% over to the right and maybe 50% over to the left, or whatever, 40-40, 50-50, from a 3D sound perspective, it's going to appear that the sound is sitting more back in the mix. It's not going to be as close to the listener. Okay, so in this track, we have like 6 or 7, 4 pairs of guitars or 3 pairs of guitars. Right now, they're all panned hard left and right. But as we get more into this mix, we may keep 2 of those hard left and right, and the other ones may be panned in a little bit more, because not only does it again, it gives it more front to back perception, but it also gives separation between the two instruments. These two instruments, they're not sitting right on top of each other, like this, where they're cluttering each other up. One is kind of sitting more back in the 3D sound field than the other. So you got to think of it that way. So again, if you were placing these live people, these live instruments on stage, would you have the two guitar players sitting on top of each other, standing one right in front of the other? No. If you had two guitar players, you'd have them spread out and you'd have them sitting either standing next to each other, or the lead guitar players out front and the rhythm guitar players kind of more in the background, closer to the drums, maybe. I don't know. Again, these are all things to think about when you're talking about your first level of controlled compression and how you want to place the instruments. Using panning and volume is one way to do that. Okay, we're about halfway through this little presentation. I want to make sure you're still with me. I know it's a little dry. I know it's not looking at a bunch of fancy plugins, but I want you to stick with it, okay? I don't want you to turn off the video. I want you to watch this through. If you're a little bit confused or you don't have your head completely wrapped around this, or this is a brand new concept and technique for you, which for most of you it probably is, go ahead and rewind the video and watch this section again. It may take a few times of you watching this entire video to really get the concept, but I promise you, if you stick with it and you forge through, this will absolutely help you. So stick with it, watch the last half of this video, and then again, click the link in the description box, use the coupon code, and go get the entire series, because we talk about a bunch of other advanced mixing concepts and techniques along with this, and then you'll have it forever. And I promise you, it'll be the best training course that you've picked up on mixing in a long, long time. Okay, so stick with it and watch the end of the video. Okay, so that's volume and panning. That's how we use volume and panning to kind of control the sound. Now, with compression, we are controlling the transient energy of a sound to place it in the 3D sound field. The louder the transient, the sound will move forward. The softer the transient, the sound will move back. So when we talk about compression, we've talked about this in the basic mixing course, and we also talked about this in Compression Made Easy. And I'm sure if you know anything about compression, you know that a compressor really, in its simplest forms, controls the transient peak, and it controls the dynamics of the sound. So if you have a snare drum, for example, let's bring back my chart. And again, I know I'm not good at this little tablet, so don't send me a bunch of emails telling me how much I stink. I know that already. But I'm doing this to try to make it easy for you to understand. I'm trying to visualize this. It's hard to explain it in words. So if we have, I'm going to get my pencil. Okay, we have a sound. We have a sound wave. We have a snare drum. And a snare drum audio sound, if you look at the snare drum, it kind of looks something like this. So you have kind of a peak, and then you kind of have, and I know this is a poor audio wave because I'm not really good at drawing with the pen. Okay, but this first hit here, this first peak, is the transient, right? Trans. The snare drum stick, the stick hits the snare drum, you have this initial peak, and then from that point it starts to decay and it starts to release, and the sound actually fades off into the distance, right? So a compressor in its simplest forms actually controls the peak, right? It lowers the dynamic range, or controls the so that the distance between the lowest sound in audio and the peak, right? This distance here is what we call our dynamic range. Right, we talked about this in Compression Made Easy, and we talked about this in the first Mixing Made Easy series. So a compressor in its simplest forms is controlling the dynamic range. So by controlling the dynamic range and by cutting down on this peak, you're lowering the peaks, depending on how hard you use the compressor, which will allow you then to lower the overall sound, and then you're using makeup gain to bring up the overall volume of this audio wave. So now the lower sections of the audio wave are now being raised up. And what this does is it takes this dynamic range and it shrinks it down, okay? So the performance is more tight. So you would have a dynamic range originally that maybe looks like this. Again, that's originally what it looks like. High peak, highest part of the sound, lowest part of the sound. And by using the compressor and shaving this off, you're actually shaving this off here, say, and now you're bringing up the overall volume. So now your dynamic range is not from this line to this line. Your dynamic range may be from this top line. Again, I know this is a poor drawing, to this line, if that makes sense. Okay, so, excuse me. So by controlling the transient, we're controlling the dynamic range. okay? And the transient, and let's go back to our presentation here. So the louder the transient, okay, the more the sound will move forward. When that stick hits that snare drum, that first transient, the louder that transient is, the more upfront in the mix it's going to sound. By using a compressor to cut that transient off a little bit, it's going to sound a little softer, and it's going to appear to move back in the 3D sound field. So we use attack and release times to control the transient and the sustain of a sound. Using release, we're controlling the sustain. By doing this, we can place the instrument within the 3D sound field and create a sense of depth in a mix. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Read that over and over again. By controlling the transient, by using attack and release, you're able to give the sound a sense of depth. The louder that transient is, the less compression that you have, the more upfront the sound is going to be. The more compression you have, the softer the transient is. It's going to appear to move back in the mix. Very similar to turning the volume up and down. If the source is louder, it's going to sound more forward. If it's quieter, it's going to sound more back. Same thing with the transient. Okay, so let's look at attack time. So when you talk about controlled compression and we look at attack time, we use attack time. Attack time is really the starting point of a sound. How much do you want to cut off that transient? How much do you want to squash down that transient energy? That's kind of where the point of where we're starting with the sound, if that makes sense. If you use a fast attack, the sound will start back in the mix, okay? Because you're cutting off more of the transient, therefore it's going to sound softer, and therefore it's going to sound like it's placed more back in the mix because you're chopping down on the sound right away with a fast attack. You're cutting off that transient, okay? With a slow attack, it's going to sound more forward because more of the transient energy is going to pop through the mix, okay? So again, by chopping off the transient more aggressively, it's going to soften that transient energy, therefore it's going to be a little quieter, therefore the sound's going to move back. By using a slow attack, you're not chopping off the transient as much, so the sound is going to pop through the mix more, and therefore it's going to sound more forward in the 3D sound field. Okay, so we're controlling the initial transient energy to place the sound where we want in the 3D sound field. So by using a slow or fast attack, we can move the instrument in a way and give it a sense of placement in the mix. So again, if we delete this, delete all these horrible drawings. Okay, so if we for example on a vocal, because that's a very energy transient heavy type of an instrument, if we cut off the vocal fast with a fast attack, that vocal could sit somewhere back here. Okay, and the more we cut off, the faster the attack, the quicker it's going to clamp down on that initial transient, the further it's going to push the sound back in the mix. Okay, with a slower attack, it's going to move. The vocal is going to sit more up here, right? Because we're letting that initial transient energy pop through. Therefore, the sound's going to sound like it's closer to the listener because we're not cutting off that transient energy. Okay, and the transient energy is going to be louder. And just like we said with volume, the louder it is, the more forward it sounds. The quieter it is, the more back in the mix it's going to sound. Okay, so we're using compression to not only control the peaks and even out the performance, but we're using it in a way to place the instruments within this 3D sound field, along with panning and with volume. Okay, so those three things is how we position our instruments in the 3D sound field. And compression is a major, major player in that. Okay, the compression is going to give you the more sense of depth than the volume and the panning is going to give you. And it's going to even out the performance and make things more solidified and more tight sounding, because that's what compression does. It tightens up a performance. Volume doesn't tighten up a performance. Panning doesn't tighten up a performance. Again, that just moves the thing front to back, left to right. But if you want to move it front to back, really compression will only move it front to back like volume will, but it also then tightens up and solidifies the sound. Okay, I hope that makes sense. Now, release time, when we're talking about controlled compression, the release time is the movement of the sound. The attack time, if we go back, is the starting point of the sound. Where's the sound going to start? The release time is how the sound is going to move. If you use a slow release, the sound will have minimal movement. The sound will sound, or the instrument will sound more solid. Bass guitar is a great example of this. Typically on a bass, most times, we'll use more of a slow release because release time also will add sustain to a note. So when you're playing bass notes, say root notes, and you're letting the note ring out and you want that note to kind of sustain, by using a slow release, the compressor is clamping onto the signal, and it's holding it there longer before it releases and lets it go. The longer it holds onto the signal, the more sustain you're going to get from the note. The sound is not going to move as much. It's going to kind of clamp down, tighten it up, and it's going to stay solid and consistent, okay? It's going to sound more solid. If you have a medium release, the sound will appear to move forward a little bit after the compressor releases the sound. So by using a medium release, if your starting point, and again, let's talk about bass for a second. Let me delete this. Get back my pencil. So if our bass guitar is sitting, I don't know, say it's sitting right here in the center, okay? Bass. Okay, so by using a long or a slow release, the sound is going to clamp down, and the sound is pretty much going to stay right here. It's not going to move very far, okay? Because we're holding on to it. It's kind of just holding on to the sound, sustaining the note, and it's going to kind of stay. By using a medium release, what's going to happen is, and some of this will depend on the attack time as well, the sound is going to, if our starting point is here with our attack time, then when we use a medium release, what's going to happen is after the compressor releases from the signal, the instrument's going to tend to push forward just a little bit. Okay, so it's almost going to have this kind of movement. It's going to kind of start off at the attack time is going to have it start here, and it's going to kind of move a little like this. It's going to go back a little, then move a little forward as it releases, okay? Because the attack time, depending on how fast that attack is how far back is it going to sit, right? Faster attack, more back it's going to sit. Slower attack, more forward it's going to sit. So if you were using a fast attack and a medium release on this bass, it would clamp down on the bass, and it would sit it back here somewhere. And then as it releases, it's going to kind of pull forward a little bit in the 3D sound field. Okay, if that makes sense. If you're using a fast release, the sound will appear to move more forward in the mix as compared to a medium release. So it's the same kind of feeling as a medium release, but it's going to pull a little more forward. Okay, so a medium release, it may only pull from here to here. A fast release, it may pull from here to here. So the quicker the release, the quicker that the compressor is gonna let go of the sound, and it's gonna push the sound a little more forward. So the attack is gonna sink it back, and then it's gonna push forward, depending on how you use that attack and release. So you can have kind of this kind of movement from front to back. So we're using compression to kind of move the sound in the 3D sound field as well. We're not just stationary anymore. We're using release time and attack time together to kind of move the sound. You kind of hear that pumping and breathing effect of a compressor. Part of that is the way we move the sound from front to back. And again, I'm over exaggerating this. It's not like it's going from here to here. It's just little movements, but it adds that sense of depth and that sense of vibe. And it's not something that you can necessarily hear all the time. It's what you can feel when you listen to a mix. Okay, so keep that in mind. I hope this makes sense. I hope this is starting to make sense to you. Okay, so let's review that again. A slow release, the sound will have minimal movement. It'll be more solid sounding. It kind of attacks, it stays stationary, it doesn't really move. A medium release, what's going to happen is the sound is going to lift, the compressor is going to let go of the sound, and the sound's going to move a little more forward in the mix. Not much, going to be a little bit of forward movement. A fast release, once the compressor releases, it's going to move the sound even further than it would be with a medium release. Okay, so that's how we control and what the 3D sound field is all about. Okay, so again, it's just about looking at your left to right and trying to visualize where do you want to place your instruments. Okay, when you're first starting out, and this is all confusing and this sounds like I'm speaking a foreign language to you, which is okay. It takes a while to wrap your head around this. This is a more advanced technique. That's why it's part of this series. Don't just think of things left to right. Think of things left, right, front to back. Okay, and then we're going to talk about top to bottom later when we talk about early reflections, which is another more advanced technique. But you want to look at your sound field like your live stage, and where do you want to place those instruments, and how do you want those instruments to move? Do you want them to stay very stationary, very locked in place, or do you want them to kind of move a little bit and have a little bit of movement? By using attack and release, like we talked about in the presentation slides, and go back and read those again. I urge you to print them out and hold them, leave them next to your DAW, and read them over and over again, and rewind this video over and over again until it sinks in. But by using attack and release, we can not only place where we want the instruments to sit, how close to the listener we want them to sit, but we can also then control how much movement we want. And do we want things static? Do we want things to kind of bounce around a little bit and move in the mix? And again, it's not something you can just hear. Oh, wow, I can hear it moving. It's a subtle thing, especially when you're only looking at, say, a bass guitar instrument. It's a very subtle thing, but it's an accumulative effect over a course of an entire mix that gives you that sense of depth, that sense of movement, that sense of just a vibe. Okay, it's extremely important, and compression is a huge player in that. Again, it's not just volume and panning. That's only part of the equation. The 50% of this equation is really the compression and how we use it. Okay, so what we're going to do now, that was kind of part 1 of section 5. I'm going to make this kind of a separate video. Part 2 is now we're going to go ahead and we're going to open up each one of these channel strips, and we're going to look at how do we use the compressor as the first thing we're going to do before we do any kind of EQing. How are we going to use the compressor to control the dynamics, place it in this 3D sound field, and get things to sound more cohesive together. And at the same time, because we're running all of our instrumentation through the Neve console, we're getting that Neve vibe. Okay, and then later on, we're going to talk about additional compression to do more than just control it in the 3D sound field, but now add vibe and analog color and tonality and all the things we've talked about in previous Made Easy series. This is more of a transparent kind of a compression to control the performances and place the instruments where we want in the 3D sound field. The next level of compression will be, how do we now take certain instruments and highlight them in a mix and add those color palettes and those color variations to the tone to make things sound more exciting. So come back for section 5, part 2, and we'll pick it up from there.